Welcome to the home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt National Historic Site and the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. My name is Amy Bracewell, and it is my privilege to serve as the National Park Service Superintendent here at the home of FDR. We are excited to unveil a brand new exhibit tonight and celebrate the research and work that Dr. Shelby Landmark has put into developing this program. There is so much to discover about President Roosevelt's strength, innovation, and outlook during his time with polio. We hope this new exhibit helps everyone understand the solutions President Roosevelt crafted to be our nation's leader in a largely inaccessible world. As most of you are familiar with President Roosevelt's history, FDR became paralyzed by polio in 1921 when he was 39. Before he could return to politics, he first had to figure out how to get around. He was confident, determined, and passionate about getting back in the political race, but he had to work hard to not only convince the country he was fit for service, but also how to show up as a confident leader. FDR used wheelchairs, crutches, canes, leg braces, handrails, automobiles, ramps, and other objects to navigate the social and physical barriers of that time. He not only relied on existing mobility devices, but he custom crafted and created new innovations that have led to many devices found in the 21st century. This new exhibit explores these devices and accommodations and what it took for President Roosevelt to be one of our country's most influential leaders who carried us through the Great Depression and World War II. This research and exhibit are all from the hard work of Dr. Shelby Landmark. Dr. Landmark joined the park this past year as our Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow. We recruited Dr. Landmark and was mentored by Frank Futrell, our retired curator, to help us explore and develop a deeper understanding of disability representation in the national parks as it relates to historic sites. According to the Center for Disease Control, 1 in 4 Americans identify as having some type of disability, and our national parks should reflect and speak to this aspect of American life. We wanted the home of FDR to champion this history and lean into the world of President Roosevelt and his use of mobility devices. We are thrilled that Dr. Landmark took on this work and that she has done so with the greatest enthusiasm, sensitivity, curiosity, and deep research into the presidential archives. Dr. Landmark joined us in 2023 with a background in cultural qualitative research and as a facilitator with expertise in disability, gender and sexuality, and media representation. She holds a PhD in communications from Texas A&M University, and she received her Bachelor of Science from Ohio University's Scripps College in Communication, where she specialized in media studies. She has published and presented her work related to disability identities, entertainment media, media literacy, gender and sexuality in multinational publications, in interdisciplinary academic journals, and at national and regional communication and disability conferences. I will say, before I call Dr. Landmark to the stage, we will have a question and answer period after her presentation, and then we would like to invite everyone to the FDR's garage stables to see this new exhibit for our reception immediately after the presentation. We will have a tram that's available for anyone who wants a ride over there. It will leave from the side of the Wallace Center. I am personally so grateful that Dr. Landmark has been a part of our team for the last 2 years, and I have been impressed by the scholarship she has produced during her short time with us. Every week in the archives, she has uncovered new attributes about President Roosevelt's life and the life of all American people. I believe the work that she has done and hopefully will continue to do is vital to our collective understanding of the complexity and the extraordinary life of this monumental figure in American history. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Shelby Landmark to the stage.
Thank you, Amy. That was very nice and touching. As Amy said, I am Dr. Shelby Landmark. That's not a coincidence that I have that last name and now I work here. It is weird though. Today I will be sharing with you one of the culminations of my work, which will be this exhibit that we will all walk over to see at the end. So I say this is my work, but it's not my work. There's a large community of people that have worked together with me. So I want to say a few thank yous before we get started into the research. This is not a comprehensive list, but number one, I want to thank Frank Futrell, the recently retired curator here at the park. This all started with you, and we've worked so closely over the last 2 years that I couldn't imagine doing any of this without him. Also, Park Superintendent Amy Bracewell, remember those days when you just asked us to put up a few pictures in that building and just real quick, just throw up some pictures and then this turned into a whole exhibit. I really appreciate your support for me. Jan Majewski of the Institute for Human-Centered Design and Michelle Hartley of the Harper's Ferry Center, I want to thank for their bi-weekly guidance on accessibility in the exhibit. Museum technician Seth Frost, who has spent countless hours with me and Frank working on this research together. Historian and FDR biographer Jeffrey C. Ward, I want to thank for his feedback on this and other FDR disability projects. His expertise and support has been invaluable. Lisa Terraconi, the Executive Director of Taconic Resources for Independence, thank you for you and your crew's feedback early in the exhibit's development. And the FDR Presidential Library. As Amy said, I have spent a lot of time in your archives, asked so many questions and been very annoying, and I'm so thankful for the support of our two agencies. The FDR Hyde Park Foundation, I want to thank for stepping in when my fellowship status seemed unclear, unsure, and offering whatever support I needed. And finally, I want to thank the American Conservation Experience, especially Eleanor Mahoney, for administering this fellowship and supporting me in this opportunity. So thank you. So like Amy said, I have a PhD in communication, but this position right now is a long title. It's basically the Mellon Humanities Postdoctoral Fellow in Disability Representation at Historic Sites. And I'm stationed here at this historic site, which is the home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Basically, the fellowship's goal is to enhance existing interpretation and create new interpretation focused on FDR's disability. Throughout the past 2 years, I have explored FDR's role and legacy in the history of disability in the United States. And in order to do that, we have to acknowledge his disability and acknowledge what was known about it at the time. So how did we get here? Why is this an issue? There's a paradox that exists about FDR, where one of the things that is best known about him is that he had polio that resulted in paralysis after 1921. On the other hand, one of the things that is the most predominant stories told about him is that people did not know either the entirety of the situation regarding his disability or they didn't know at all that he had one. So this is the first time the National Park Service has conducted its own research in this area. Previously, interpretation has been based on outside historians' work, which usually involves a lot of secondary sources like reminiscences or posthumous biographies. This is the first time we really took the time to look into primary source material, contemporaneous newspapers, FDR's words himself, And we have a much different story than what was previously told. So for some context, today we understand wheelchairs as a symbol of access and mobility, but that was not always the case. In FDR's time, there were no curb cuts, there were few ramps, there were not wheelchairs everywhere. There was limited access for somebody who had a physical disability. When FDR began using wheelchairs in 1921, they were large, they were not very mobile, and they were mostly intended to be used in hospitals or institution settings. Basically, you would be pushed out into the lawn and left there all day. So they were very comfortable, but they were not intended to get you to places. These were often also called invalid chairs. So a word we wouldn't use today, but they had that connotation of not being, an invalid. If you think about what that word means, it doesn't mean you're a productive person in society. It means you can't do much. And that was the connotation for anyone who used a wheelchair at the time. So they were very confining. They were limiting. They were not a symbol of access the way we know wheelchairs to be now. And FDR grew up knowing about wheelchairs because his own father and his grandfather both used large, cumbersome wheelchairs. So he would have seen what it was like to live and use one of those. So we're going to look at some of those large wheelchairs here. The first picture on the left, you'll see a 14-year-old FDR with his elbow leaning on his maternal grandfather's very large wheelchair. He's surrounded by his grandchildren. This is Sarah Delano's father, Warren. He used a wheelchair after a series of falls in his life. He was also blind in one eye, and FDR grew up, as you can see, very familiar with what it would have been like to use a very large chair like this. In the middle, you'll see an early wheelchair used by FDR's father, James, who had cardiac health issues. It's kind of hard to tell from the picture, but this is very large. Like, picture a love seat. It's pretty big. The third picture is a chair that FDR himself may have used. We also think it was maybe used by his father during the first year of FDR's paralysis, before he had innovated the chair that we know him for. He had tried out one of these chairs. It would not have fit or even reached inside the elevator at Springwood, so it was not very useful. Instead, we know FDR designed or innovated a different type of chair for the time. It's one that had not really been seen before. Often described as a little kitchen chair on wheels, these were much smaller chairs. They did not have armrests, and that facilitated him to be able to easily move from this wheelchair into a stationary chair, like a desk chair or a dining chair. But most importantly, probably, is that its small size allowed him to access pretty much every part of his home with the elevator, and he had to add simple ramps also in his home, but they were much more useful and mobile. In the middle, you'll see a similar type of chair designed by FDR. We think this one became the prototype for chairs that were sold at his Warm Springs Polio Rehabilitation Center. And then in the third photo, you can see FDR himself seated in one of these custom wheelchairs while vacationing in the Bahamas in around 1935. So, if there's not a lot of evidence for where this story came from, this story that nobody knew he had a disability, that FDR tried to keep it a secret, that he was deceptive about it. When I came here, I looked for this evidence, I couldn't find it. So if there's not a lot of evidence, where does this story come from? Why is this so predominant? And we think one of the reasons is this focus on the wheelchairs, this focus on the lack of photos of him sitting in a wheelchair in particular. So we're gonna look at that situation. 3 by 2 years here, spending a lot of time in the archives and in the primary source material, I have yet to find a formal prohibition against any photographs taken of FDR in a wheelchair. So nowhere have I found it written down that the press or the public were not allowed to take photos of him in a wheelchair. We have yet to find it. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I haven't found it. Hasn't been found. There is a scant bit of evidence that there was some sort of strategic management happening, and so I'm going to show you those 2 pieces of evidence that I found. So of all the time I've spent, there's only two pieces. So Look at some of these sources of this narrative. Number one, Life magazine published a photo of FDR being pushed in a wheelchair, I believe in 1937. And we have a piece of evidence from FDR's press secretary, Stephen Early, where Stephen wrote to FDR's physician this following quote: "Here's a picture of the president in his wheelchair, a scene we have never permitted to be photographed. I do think this should be investigated and steps taken to prevent any repetition." That sounds like there is some kind of strategic management of photos taken of him using a wheelchair. However, this is a private letter from his press secretary to his physician. This is not a letter to the editor of Life magazine. This is not a letter published in a newspaper for the rest of the press to adhere to. There's also no evidence that Stephen Early investigated this issue. And for context, Stephen Early had really strict rules for photographs taken of the president that had nothing to do with his wheelchair. For example, they really were cautious about certain photographers gaining exclusive rights to photos. So he would set up during a public appearance, everyone's going to take the same picture at this time and at this time. That way there was nobody who got an exclusive photo and had an advantage that could then complain and say, why did you give this newspaper access and not me? So everybody needed to take the same photos. So this was a sneaky photo taken of him. So that would have been against Stephen Early's rules, whether FDR was in a wheelchair or not. Another one of these rules is that Stephen Early did not allow photographers to get very close to FDR. I think he said about 12 feet they needed to stay away. And that was for a couple of reasons. Number one, the flash was aggressive on those old cameras, and it would have blinded him, and if everyone is taking these photos, it wouldn't have been very comfortable for FDR. Secondly, if you have a crowd of people approaching the president, it's very easy then for the safety measures to be ignored, and for somebody who wishes to harm the president could sneak up and harm him. So he needed photographers to stay a certain distance. So this is just an example of the many rules that Stephen Early had about photographing FDR that had nothing to do with him being in a wheelchair. We could also assume that perhaps because we know the editor of Life at this time was antagonistic towards FDR, that maybe Stephen Early was even mad about the fact that FDR was being pushed in his wheelchair in this photo. So less about that he's sitting in the wheelchair, but more about he's being pushed. We don't know what the reason is that Stephen Early had a problem with this. And we can't just attribute the reason to be because FDR didn't want that photo taken. We don't have that piece of evidence yet, if it exists. The second piece of evidence of a strategic management is this memo sent from FDR's naval aide to Winston Churchill's personal assistant. And this was on the Atlantic charter trip. And this memo said, "For your information, the president is never photographed when walking or in his wheelchair." That's evidence of some sort of strategic management, right? However, again, this is not strategic management with the press. This is specifically a memo to a foreign powers military unit. Access given to a foreign powers military is not the same context as access you would or would not give to the press. So again, we don't know why this prohibition was there or this management was there, so we can't just attribute the reason to be because FDR didn't want people to know. We don't have enough evidence for that. Let's say we did find evidence of a formal prohibition. If that did exist, we also have evidence that FDR did not always abide by his advisors' wishes regarding his interactions with the press. So at his first White House conference, I'm going to read to you what the New York Times published. "President Roosevelt settled back in his chair and let the queries come thick and fast today. Mr. Roosevelt laid down certain rules today. One was that he was not to be quoted directly unless a transcript of his remarks was given out by the White House." Again, that's that exclusive rights prohibition. "Twice during the conference today, President Roosevelt obligingly turned his chair towards photographers in one end of the room for pictures, a distinct innovation permitted by Mr. Roosevelt personally after his secretaries had vetoed cameras. At the end, a spontaneous burst of hand clapping from the news writers indicated their feelings towards this new dispensation." So here we have, published in the New York Times, an example of FDR's advisors setting down some kind of strategic management of what photos can and cannot be taken of him, and he's specifically disobeying that, which I think tracks with what we know of his character. He was kind of a jokester, very cheeky. It makes sense that he would have been like, you know what, it's okay at this first conference. So even if we did find very clear evidence that there was a prohibition between FDR and the press, or between FDR's advisors and the press, we also have evidence like this, that FDR did not always listen to his advisors. So for some more context for wheelchair use at the time, there wasn't really infrastructure for you to use a wheelchair in public. So even if FDR had wanted to be seen in his wheelchair a lot, he wouldn't have been able to use it in a public setting because of things like the lack of curb cuts, the lack of ramps, etc. He would have been required to walk at least part of the way, everywhere that he traveled, except for Top Cottage, which is the home he designed to be accessible to him, as well as Warm Springs, which he also designed from the beginning to be accessible to people with physical disabilities. So instead of a wheelchair, because he couldn't have used one in public, even if he wanted to, we have evidence that FDR used his automobiles as mobility devices. And we are confident saying that because he uses his automobiles in very unusual ways, even for the time. So I have some photos here. You can see in this first photo, FDR is planting a tree from his car. Not your typical use of a car, right? In the second photo, he's planting another tree, another instance. Very unusual. This photo you can see in our exhibit. This is a photo representing the types of temporary ramps that were built for him to drive his cars up and give speeches or do whatever he needed to do for his public appearance from his vehicle. This photo you can see FDR throwing out the first pitch at a baseball game from his car. Again, not a typical use of an automobile even for the time. This photo on the bottom, you can see FDR petting a horse from his car. He had lots of interactions with animals from the car. Here you can see the press lining up their microphones for him to be able to give a speech from his car so he didn't have to get out. Again, meeting people, shaking hands from the car. Your normal president at the time, your normal foreign dignitaries or whoever, this is not how they would have done this public appearance. You would have got out of your car. So this was an unusual use of the car that people would have noticed. Here you can see a huge crowd of people listening to him give a speech from the jump seat of his car. We also have some evidence that FDR discussed the use of his wheelchairs in public and discussed his disability in public. When you go to the exhibit, you'll see a few quotes from FDR himself talking about disability and talking about himself having one. But specifically, on election eve in 1932, the New York Times published this quote, or this story. On the way to Beacon, the governor made a brief stop at the Castle Hill Veterans Hospital, where he said, "I'm sorry that I can't visit all the wards as I would like to today," he said to the veterans who crowded around his car. "But I want to come back here, and if the superintendent will give me a wheelchair when I come back after March 4th, I want to see every one of them." This was the New York Times, where the future president of the United States, the hopeful president, is saying, if I had a wheelchair, I could come back and visit this place. So he's very clearly mentioning his use of a wheelchair there. In the second example, it's a little less explicit, but this is at the dedication of the Whiteface Mountain Memorial Highway in 1935, and this is a quote from FDR. He said, "And so, my friends, I'm very happy to be here. I wish very much that it were possible for me to walk up the few remaining feet to the actual top of the mountain. Someday they are going to make it possible for people who cannot make the little climb to go up there in a comfortable and easy elevator." So he's not directly mentioning that he needed a wheelchair to visit here, but he is saying, I can't visit, I can't go up these stairs. He's very clearly identifying himself as having a disability, a physical disability. So when we say no one knew that FDR had a disability, we erase his use of all of these other mobility devices, such as the automobile, but I'm going to show you some of the other devices right now, and this is really what the exhibit is about. This is important because FDR was one of the most well-traveled people at the time, for sure, for a president. He made a lot of public appearances after he became paralyzed. He traveled 50,000 plus miles by train. He visited every state of the Union. He delivered 800 plus public speeches, and he made 53 international trips to 17 different countries. And at every single one of these, he had to use multiple types of mobility devices in public. So again, this is kind of the essence of this new exhibit. Before he could return to politics, he had to figure out how to get around, and the way he did that was by using these different mobility devices. And these are the objects we're highlighting tonight. First set of images are FDR's public use of canes. So he eventually learned how to walk with the use of leg braces, canes, often his arm on a bodyguard, a son, somebody like that. In the first photo, you can see FDR pushing through a crowd of hundreds of people and using a cane. And this amount of people would have seen him doing the very distinctive walk that he did, which was not unique to him. It was called corrective walking. It was a very common technique at the time, but it was very obvious that this was not an able-bodied person walking. In the middle, you can see FDR using a cane, getting out of a vehicle, again, in front of people. He's using the arm of, I believe that's Earl Miller. And then in this third photo, you can see FDR very clearly using a cane, standing on the south terrace of Springwood. And to his left, you can see the steps and railings, which we highlight in the exhibit, and we'll talk about a little bit more here. Another type of device he used in public were ramps for himself. So he used them to get on boats, to get in and out of vehicles, to get in and out of buildings. In this first photo, you can see FDR arriving to get onto Vincent Astor's yacht, the Normal Hall. And you can see the ramp that was put up for him to smoothly exit the automobile and get onto the boat. In the middle, you can see FDR exiting the Potomac yacht, and he would have used the railings on these ramps to propel himself forward by himself, independently. Third, you can see FDR using a very slapdash ramp to get out of his vehicle into this building. So lots of different types of ramps were used by him, but almost everywhere he went, he had to have ramps. Here on the left, but over here is an interesting picture of an automobile ramp that was built specifically for FDR. This is at Ebbets Field, which was the Dodgers Stadium in 1944. And you can see on the left a photo of the stand that was built for the press, so they could be elevated. That would match with the ramp that was built for his car. So right across from where he was giving his speech, the press were standing there, recording, taking photos, etc. The New York Times published this photo, and they described the process that FDR went through to lock his leg braces, get out of the automobile, stand at the podium, give a speech, get back in, unlock the braces. They described the whole process, and they described the 10,000 people who watched it. Another interesting device that FDR used was custom podiums. So in this photo on the left, you can see an example of this type of podium. This was one that was gifted to him. So enough people knew that he needed this specific type of podium that it was gifted to him. This is FDR speaking to a packed house at the Municipal Auditorium in Kansas City in 1936. Secret Service agent Gus Getteridge is seated directly behind FDR holding the president's cane, so you can also see that right there. This image is a very interesting finding from my time in the archives in the Secret Service records. So this is an example of a diagram that the Secret Service drew and distributed to an advanced team of agents that would go to whatever FDR's next speaking location was going to be, and they would make sure he had ramps, steps, podiums, whatever he needed to be able to do that public appearance. So they would distribute these diagrams, and they would go, and if there was not a suitable podium, they would hire local carpenters to build these types of podiums. So very detailed instructions, including the material to be used on the bottom of the ramp, the material to be used where he would place his hands, etc. Very detailed. Another type of device that he used was crutches, and this was particularly early on after the onset of paralysis, and that's typically how corrective walking was done. You usually learned how to use crutches first, and then you kind of graduated to using a cane if you could. Both had to be used with the leg braces though. So in the photo on the left, you can see FDR with Democratic nominee for US President John W. Davis, and this is at Springwood here in August 1924. So just a few years after he got polio, and he's using these crutches. Again, you can see FDR here using crutches in 1924 at a convention in Pittsburgh. Very obvious use of a mobility device right there. This slide represents his use of leg braces. So in all of these devices, the ramps, the steps, he would have used the leg braces. In the first image on the left, you can see FDR exiting the vehicle, and he's walking through a crowd at the dedication ceremony at the home of Woodrow Wilson in Virginia in May of 1941. And he's using his cane with his leg braces. In the middle, you can see FDR when he was seated, you can see his leg braces. They were often visible like this. This is during a trip with friends to Montreal. Here's a up-close photo of his leg braces. You will also see this photo in the exhibit. He ordered some of his leg braces from the Warm Springs Foundation's brace shop, so they made their own braces there, custom. But he would use his own shoes. So ordinary shoes could be fitted with the leg braces to be attached so that he could continue to walk. And you'll see a pair of those shoes in our exhibit, and you can see where the leg braces attached. This is a wonderful photo that I love of FDR exiting a vehicle. This is at the Hollywood Bowl in 1932. And you can see what we think are Secret Service agents locking his leg braces in preparation for him to stand up and use one of these mobility devices to go give a speech or do whatever he was required to do that day. Finally, in our mobility device series tonight, I have what's called interposed steps and railings. So these are those steps we saw earlier on the terrace of Springwood. You can see them right here. This is where they would have lived while FDR was alive. We do have these original steps. We have our chief of maintenance is actually working on restoring a replica to put up on the steps, so you'll be able to see those in the coming months. But this photo is interesting because this is a photo taken by the Historical American Building Survey, which the intent of that survey is to document historic structures for permanent record. And it's interesting that this was 1941 when FDR was alive, and he did not choose to hide those steps for the permanent record. Here you can see FDR showing off how he would use these types of steps, these interposed steps and railings. This is in New York City at their townhouse, which is now a part of Hunter College. But what's significant about these steps is that they were used on every one of his residences. So here, New York City, he had 2 sets at the Capitol building. They were very important for him. According to his chauffeur, he would be driven up to the steps, and then he liked to take himself up and down. He didn't like to be carried. He preferred to be independent. Like Amy said, we have a tram to shuttle you if you need it. Otherwise, we're going to walk over to the exhibit for refreshments and to see the brand new exhibit. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you over there.
He lost a lot of that.
Detectability height. So if you didn't have this, you would have to put a bar. No. And then the depth, they're a little bit.
As long as he stays in Sesame Street, right? Like, that's the difference. Well, yeah.